On a bitterly cold February morning in the year 1934, a magnificent estate rested gracefully upon the rolling hills of Missouri, standing tall and proud like a grand European castle that had somehow found its way to the heart of the American Midwest. The structure was commanding, extraordinary, and unmistakably built for permanence. Its thick stone walls had been raised not merely for shelter, but for significance, as a declaration to the world that the people who lived inside them had earned their place in history. And yet, behind all of that carefully constructed grandeur, inside one of its quietly elegant rooms, a man was engaged in a deeply personal struggle, one that no amount of wealth, achievement, or legacy could resolve on his behalf. For months, his body had been waging a war against him. The weight of heart disease pressed heavily on his chest. Gout had made movement painful and exhausting. Dropsy had caused swelling that turned even the simplest moments of rest into an exercise in endurance. Every passing hour had become a quiet negotiation between a determined spirit and a body that had simply given too much for too long. This was a man who had done what very few in American history had ever managed to accomplish. He had guided a brewing empire through Prohibition, the single greatest legislative threat to everything his family had built, and he had come out the other side with the company still breathing. He had watched the Anheuser-Busch name grow from a regional label into one of the most recognized and respected brands in the entire country. He had survived an era of anti-German sentiment, navigated World War I, adapted his company through crises that would have broken lesser men, and still managed to keep the machinery of a dynasty running with discipline and resolve. His accomplishments were extraordinary by any measure. And yet, on that icy February morning, none of those victories could reach him where he was. His loyal chauffeur arrived that morning as he always did, entering the room with quiet familiarity, reaching for the radio dial with the gentle intention of filling the space with music. Something warm, something human, something that might soften the weight of the silence that had settled over the room. What followed instead was a sound that no one in that household would ever forget. It was the sound of a man who had carried more than any single person should carry, finally releasing the burden he could no longer hold. August Anheuser-Busch Sr., president of the largest and most powerful brewing company in the United States of America, had reached the end of his journey, and he chose to meet it on his own terms, with a pearl-handled revolver resting beside a brief handwritten note that carried more emotion than any lengthy letter ever could. The note was not a speech. It was not a manifesto. It was simply a farewell, gentle, intimate, and deeply human. "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children," he wrote, underlining two words as if he wanted those particular expressions of love to rise above everything else and be the final impression the world carried of him. Precious. Adorable. These were not the words people expected from a titan of industry. The world tends to imagine its most powerful families as untouchable figures gliding through time in polished shoes and carefully arranged photographs, never cracking under pressure, never bending in ways that ordinary people recognize from their own lives. But what happened in that room on that February morning was not a story of failure. It was a story of humanity, the kind that reminds us that every powerful name in history belongs first and foremost to a person who felt things deeply, carried things quietly, and sometimes reached a point where the body simply could not continue regardless of how strong the will remained. That moment is the first and most important clue to understanding what Grant's Farm truly represents. Because this estate was never simply a mansion. It was never just a collection of beautifully arranged rooms and carefully tended grounds. It was an altar built to the idea of ambition, a fortress constructed on land that had already absorbed decades of American mythology long before the Busch family ever arrived. The property carried a name that did not belong to the Busch family at all. It was called Grant's Farm, a name bound to one of the most complex and fascinating figures in all of American history, a man who would eventually rise to become the 18th President of the United States, but who first arrived on that very land not as a celebrated commander, not as a national hero, but as a struggling farmer wrestling with stubborn Missouri soil and the kind of relentless misfortune that tests a person's character to its deepest core. Grant's Farm was, in its earliest chapter, a place where the American dream looked small and uncertain and desperate long before it ever looked triumphant. And that is the quietly astonishing truth about this estate. It sits at the intersection of two entirely different American stories that seem on the surface to be completely incompatible with each other. One is a story of hardship, financial collapse, and the humbling weight of circumstances that even a remarkable man could not escape. The other is a story of immigrant ambition so vast, so determined, and so strategically executed that it ultimately reshaped the commercial and cultural landscape of an entire nation. When those two stories finally collided on that piece of Missouri countryside, they did not neutralize each other. They did not cancel each other out or simplify into something comfortable. Instead, they layered themselves together like strata pressed into stone, and the result was an estate that could never fully step out from beneath the extraordinary weight of everything that had come before it. To truly understand why that mansion in 1934 became the setting for such a profoundly human moment, it is necessary to travel much farther back in time than the estate itself. It is necessary to cross an ocean and arrive in the Old World, in a small German village called Kastel, where a family that understood the principles of trade, discipline, and structured ambition was already shaping the character of a boy who would one day change American commerce forever. In the summer of 1839, a child was born into that household. His name was Adolphus Busch, and he entered the world as one of 22 children raised under the roof of a father who believed firmly that education and personal drive were the two most valuable things a son could carry into adulthood. Growing up surrounded by the language of business and commerce, Adolphus developed an instinct for opportunity that most people spend their entire lives never fully cultivating. He learned early, and he learned well, that if a person genuinely wants to build something meaningful, they cannot afford to wait passively for circumstances to arrange themselves in their favor. They must move with intention and move before the moment passes. At the age of 18, in the year 1857, Adolphus Busch did exactly what millions of hopeful souls would eventually do, but he did it with a clarity of purpose that set him apart from the very beginning. He gathered what little he had, boarded a ship leaving Germany behind, and pointed himself toward the United States of America with the kind of quiet certainty that distinguishes people who are going somewhere from people who are simply going. He arrived first in New Orleans and then traveled up the great Mississippi River to St. Louis, a city already alive with the energy of German immigrants and the restless, uncontainable ambition of a young nation expanding in every direction at once. He arrived without great wealth and without deep social connections. But he arrived with a mind that had been trained since boyhood to recognize patterns, to understand systems, and to see opportunity where others only saw risk. Those early years in St. Louis were demanding and unglamorous in the way that all meaningful beginnings tend to be. Adolphus worked as a clerk along the riverfront, spending his days watching cargo and currency move from one hand to another, quietly absorbing the real mechanics of how American commerce actually functioned beneath the surface of its more visible energy. He saved with discipline. And when his father passed away and a modest inheritance arrived, Adolphus did not approach that money as a windfall to be enjoyed. He treated it as a foundation to be built upon. He invested carefully, partnering with another German immigrant to establish a business that supplied the local brewing industry with the essential materials it needed to operate: hops, malt, specialized equipment, and the unglamorous but absolutely critical infrastructure that kept small breweries running even when their profits remained thin. It was a perceptive angle from which to enter the market, because St. Louis in those years was populated with small German-owned breweries serving a thirsty immigrant community, and every single one of those breweries needed supplies whether or not their own businesses were thriving. Adolphus was not simply selling ingredients. He was patiently and deliberately building relationships with the very people who controlled access to a market defined by deep cultural loyalty and genuine, consistent demand. It was through this network of relationships that Adolphus first crossed paths with a man named Eberhard Anheuser, a prosperous soap manufacturer who had acquired a struggling brewery in St. Louis with the intention of turning it into something worthwhile. The brewery itself was not yet distinguished. The beer it produced was serviceable but unremarkable, a product without particular identity or reach. But Eberhard Anheuser had something that Adolphus recognized as far more valuable than current performance. He had position, he had resources, and most importantly, he had a family. And the most transformative business arrangements in American history have frequently begun not in boardrooms but around dining tables. In 1861, Adolphus Busch married Eberhard's daughter Lily in a remarkable double ceremony in which his brother simultaneously married Lily's sister. The occasion looked every inch like a celebration of love, and it genuinely was, but it was also the kind of strategic alignment that changes the course of industries. Almost immediately after that wedding, the Civil War erupted across the country, and Adolphus enlisted in the Union Army. He served with the focused discipline that already defined his character, and when the war eventually concluded, he returned to St. Louis carrying new confidence and a sharper, more refined understanding of what it would take to stop being an immigrant entrepreneur and start being something genuinely historic. He joined his father-in-law's brewery with energy and vision and immediately began approaching it not as a local enterprise but as the seed of something national. He was not content to improve the beer alone, though he did that too. What he was truly focused on was transforming the entire concept of how beer could exist in America. The industry at that time was fundamentally a local affair. a collection of neighborhood enterprises bound by geography, limited by the unavoidable reality that beer spoiled quickly and could not survive long journeys without losing quality. Most brewers accepted that limitation as simply the nature of the business. Adolphus Busch did not accept limitations that could be solved through engineering and investment. He became deeply absorbed in the science of preservation, embracing pasteurization as a method of stabilizing beer so that it could be shipped without deterioration. He then pushed further, investing in refrigerated railroad cars cooled with ice that allowed the product to travel long distances while maintaining its integrity. These were not small refinements. They were revolutionary decisions that fundamentally altered what a brewing company could become in the American landscape. He was constructing the infrastructure of a national brand at a time when almost everyone else in the industry was still thinking locally. Then came the brand that would define not just the Busch family but an entire cultural relationship between America and its most beloved beverage. In 1876, Adolphus developed a lighter, crisper, more approachable style of beer inspired by the Bohemian Pilsners of the Czech lands, a deliberate departure from the heavier German styles that dominated existing tastes. He named it Budweiser, drawing on the old-world prestige associated with the city of Budweiser while simultaneously repositioning its symbolism for an entirely American audience. Not a beer for royalty. The king of beers. The brilliance of that framing was in its inversion. It claimed the title of royalty for the ordinary person, and in doing so, it made every person who drank it feel like they were participating in something elevated. By the time the company had formally become Anheuser-Busch, and by the time Adolphus had ascended to the presidency following Eberhard's passing, the enterprise was already accelerating beyond anything its early years had suggested was possible. By 1901, it had surpassed all competitors and become the largest brewing operation in the United States, moving more than 1 million barrels in a single year. Adolphus Busch was no longer the young man who had arrived on American shores with modest means and unlimited determination. He was one of the wealthiest and most consequential businessmen in the country, and he lived with an expansiveness that reflected both his achievements and his deeply held belief that a life of significance deserved to be lived with corresponding grandeur. He maintained multiple residences across the country, traveled with the ease and presence of visiting royalty rather than a merchant, contributed generously to cultural institutions and public relief efforts, and nurtured his connections to Germany with affectionate pride, even commissioning a magnificent European villa named for his wife. He had not merely succeeded in America. He had conquered the American dream so thoroughly that he could now afford to dress it in the aesthetic vocabulary of the European aristocracy he had once left behind. But men of Adolphus Busch's particular temperament are rarely satisfied with wealth alone. Wealth can be accumulated, lost, multiplied, or diminished. What a man of his ambition truly seeks is permanence, something that binds his name to the physical world in a way that will endure long after the commercial particulars of his success have faded into history. And that desire would eventually lead the family to a specific and deeply storied piece of Missouri countryside, land already layered with the complex, contradictory, and deeply compelling story of another man who understood both the glory of ambition and the humbling weight of its failures. In the 1840s, long before Budweiser was a name anyone recognized and long before Prohibition was even imaginable, a young military officer named Ulysses S. Grant found himself stationed near St. Louis, where he visited a sprawling plantation called White Haven, owned by the Dent family. The land was beautiful and expansive, cultivated through the labor systems of its era, shaped by the economic and social realities that defined that period of American history. Grant fell deeply in love there, both with the landscape and with Julia Dent, the daughter of the household, who would become the partner of his entire life's remarkable journey. He proposed to her beneath a tree on that very property, a gesture that was equal parts romantic and deeply human. Grant married Julia and received 80 acres of Missouri land as part of their new beginning together. With that land, he set out to do exactly what American culture told every man of his generation he should do: become a provider, a landowner, a self-sufficient farmer who carved dignity out of the earth with his own hands. He built a cabin on that property using timber he cut himself, and he named it Hardscrabble, a name that sounded almost like self-deprecating humor but that proved in time to be an uncomfortably accurate description of what the years ahead would feel like. The crops resisted him. The weather did not cooperate. The soil returned less than the effort demanded. Grant found himself selling firewood in the streets of St. Louis simply to keep his family from falling behind, standing in the cold with a future that looked nothing like what a man of his abilities might have imagined for himself. These were not the years that history would eventually celebrate. These were the quiet, unglamorous years of struggle that preceded all the rest. the ones that shaped the man's character in ways that military training alone never could. Eventually Grant returned to Whitehaven, and then the Civil War called him back into uniform. This time into a role that would carry him from the Missouri countryside to the commanding heights of American history, first as one of the most decisive Union generals of the entire conflict and ultimately as the 18th President of the United States. But hardscrabble remained standing throughout all of it, a rare and remarkably honest artifact of a famous man's ordinary years. And after his presidency concluded, Grant's story took another difficult turn. He became entangled in a complex Wall Street arrangement that ended in financial collapse, and in the depths of that crisis, he was compelled to relinquish the Missouri property he had loved. Grant passed away in 1885, having spent his final days racing against declining health to complete the personal memoirs that would ensure his family's financial security and permanently secure his reputation in the American imagination. He finished them just days before the end, and those memoirs stand to this day as one of the finest pieces of prose produced by any figure in American political history. The land he had once farmed, struggled on, and ultimately been forced to release passed through several different sets of hands before arriving in 1903 at a pivotal moment. In that year, the southern portion of Grant's historic Missouri property was purchased by the Busch family, not as a patriotic tribute to a former president, not as a historical preservation project, but as a private statement of arrival. It was acquired by Adolphus Busch as a gift for his eldest son, August Anheuser Busch Sr., and it was meant to serve as a sanctuary, a place for riding and hunting and family gatherings, a retreat from the demands of the brewing empire, a green and spacious place to simply breathe. But August Sr. did not have the temperament of a man who simply retreats. He had the temperament of a man who builds statements. He had grown up inside the empire. He understood the brewing business not as an abstraction but as a craft and a machine, and he had inherited from his father the deep conviction that a family of their standing deserved surroundings that communicated the full magnitude of their achievement. When he looked at that Missouri countryside, he did not see a retreat. He saw a canvas. In 1910, construction began on what would become one of the most extraordinary private residences in the entire American Midwest. August Sr. engaged architects and planners with a singular brief: build something that competes with the grandest estates of Europe and communicates without ambiguity that the Busch family has not merely arrived in America, they have become America. What emerged over the following years was a mansion conceived in the French Renaissance revival tradition, drawing inspiration from the great chateaux of France's Loire Valley while adapting that sensibility with a distinctly American firmness. Where the Loire chateaux tended toward pale stone and delicate ornamental flourishes, this structure was built in rich red brick, heavier, more resolved, more deliberately powerful. It projected wealth without vanity and strength without aggression. It rose to 3 full stories over a generous basement, containing more than 24 rooms, 14 bathrooms, and spaces designed on a scale that made clear their purpose was not simply domestic comfort but grand hospitality. Inside, every surface and every detail had been selected as though it were a trophy. Tiffany stained glass illuminated hunting scenes in jeweled color. A dedicated gun room displayed trophies and artifacts gathered from expeditions around the world. The floors moved between oak, walnut, and marble depending on the room's intended character. Art celebrating the American West decorated the walls, because even as the family constructed something that looked unmistakably European in its architecture and spirit, they wanted to remain in the imagination of the American public as people who also belonged to the frontier story, as builders and conquerors in the tradition of Western expansion. The mansion was completed in 1913 at a cost that was considered remarkable even by the standards of that gilded era, and it stood immediately as one of the grandest private homes anywhere in the region. August Sr. and his wife Alice moved into it, and for a brief and luminous moment, it seemed as though the family had achieved the extraordinary, a perfect synthesis of old-world elegance and new-world power, a palace constructed on ground already consecrated by presidential history, a dynasty that had planted its roots so deeply into American soil that nothing could pull it loose. In that same year of completion, however, the first great shadow arrived. Adolphus Busch passed away in Germany, and his body was carried home to St. Louis, where immense and visibly moved crowds lined the streets of the city to pay their respects. The memorial was not simply a moment of grief for a family. It was a civic event, a public acknowledgement that this immigrant who had arrived on American shores with little more than ambition and intelligence had become, in the span of a single lifetime, genuinely indispensable to American culture. August Sr. assumed the leadership of the empire and inherited not only its extraordinary reach but also a rapidly shifting set of external pressures. World War I brought with it a powerful tide of anti-German sentiment that transformed the very heritage the Busch family had always carried as a point of cultural pride into something that now required careful navigation. The German immigrant identity that had once made the brand feel authentic and artisanal was suddenly a liability in the court of American public opinion. And then, before that particular storm had fully settled, a far larger one gathered on the horizon. It was not driven by national origin or wartime politics. It was driven by moral conviction, legislative momentum, and the organized force of a movement that had been building in America for decades. Prohibition arrived in 1920 with the 18th Amendment, and it was designed with one straightforward purpose: to end the legal production and sale of alcohol in the United States permanently. For the majority of American breweries, it accomplished exactly that. Operations that had served communities for generations simply ceased to exist. Entire industries collapsed quietly and completely. The assumption shared by most observers was that Anheuser-Busch would follow the same path. August Sr. had a different idea entirely. Rather than accepting dissolution, he transformed the company into something that Prohibition could not reach. Anheuser-Busch pivoted with remarkable speed and discipline into the production of goods that had nothing to do with alcohol. Malt syrup intended for home bakers, commercial bakers' yeast, soft drinks, corn syrup, ice cream, refrigeration equipment, and a range of other products that allowed the company's factories and workforce to remain operational through 13 long years of legal restriction. It was not the business August Sr. had inherited. It was not the empire Adolphus had built. But it was survival, and in the context of an era that eliminated virtually every competitor, survival was itself a form of victory. The company remained intact. Its infrastructure was preserved. Its people remained employed. And when December of 1933 finally brought the repeal of Prohibition, Anheuser-Busch was positioned to respond immediately and decisively. The first legal cases of Budweiser came rolling off the production line with a readiness that felt almost triumphant, because it was. The company had been waiting for exactly this moment, and it was prepared. For August Sr., that repeal should have been the crowning achievement of a life defined by discipline, endurance, and remarkable strategic resilience. It should have been the moment of celebration that everything before it had earned. But the human body does not align its calendar with business milestones, and by late 1933 and into 1934, August Sr.'s physical condition had declined to a point that no professional success could address or ease. The weight of long illness, constant physical discomfort, and the accumulated exhaustion of decades spent carrying an empire through extraordinary pressures had taken a toll that went far deeper than what was visible. The family had also absorbed a fear of a different kind several years earlier. In 1930, a 13-year-old grandson had been taken from the family's safety and held for several distressing hours before being returned unharmed after a ransom was arranged. The boy came home, but the experience left behind a lasting awareness that the very visibility their success had created could make the people they loved vulnerable in ways that wealth alone could not fully prevent. By February of 1934, August Sr. had reached the limits of what his body and spirit could continue to sustain. The mansion that had been conceived and built as a monument to everything the Busch family had accomplished became the place where he chose to release the burden he could no longer carry. The coroner's jury convened at the estate itself, and their finding was stated plainly and without embellishment. The cause was determined to be the result of long illness. Thousands of people came to pay their respects in the days that followed, among them senators, fellow brewers, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who understood that they were witnessing the close of a chapter that had shaped American commercial and cultural history in ways most of them were still processing. August Sr. had left specific wishes regarding his burial. He did not want to rest in the grand family mausoleum alongside his parents, but rather on the grounds near the estate he had created, within sight of the land that had mattered most to him. Even in the final arrangement of his affairs, he held onto the property as though its earth could anchor something permanent in a world that kept moving. The mansion fell into a kind of considered quiet after his passing. His widow moved into the smaller cottage on the grounds, and the grand house itself was opened only occasionally, its rooms filling not with the bustle of family life but with the particular stillness of a space that holds more memories than activity. Into that stillness, slowly and with the distinctive energy of someone constitutionally unable to remain quiet for long, moved the next figure in the story. He had stood at his father's memorial with all the complexity of a son who had grown up in enormous shadow and was now stepping out of it. His name was August Anheuser-Busch Jr., and to nearly everyone who knew him he was simply Gussy. Born in 1899, raised within the full privilege of the family's remarkable wealth and standing, Gussy had nevertheless developed a personality that seemed almost deliberately shaped as the opposite of quiet, measured suffering. Where his father had been methodical, restrained, and deeply private, Gussy was expansive, theatrical, and constitutionally incapable of conducting himself without being fully and memorably present in every room he entered. He loved spectacle and speed and animals and laughter and hunting and beautiful women and the feeling of doing things on a large scale. He loved the idea that life was not a resource to be conserved carefully but a performance to be delivered with full commitment. During the long years of Prohibition, while the older generation managed the difficult work of transformation and survival, Gussy was learning the art of salesmanship from the ground up. He was learning how to read a room, how to make a pitch feel like a conversation, how to turn the machinery of a business into something that people genuinely wanted to be part of. When Prohibition ended and the beer came back, he helped orchestrate what became one of the most celebrated and enduring marketing moments in the entire history of American business. A magnificent horse-drawn wagon pulled by 8 towering Clydesdales, delivering the first legal cases of Budweiser to the White House as a symbol of a nation stepping back into the light of something familiar and joyful. It was the kind of gesture that could only have been imagined by someone who understood instinctively that the most powerful messages are not communicated through words but through images that people carry in their hearts for the rest of their lives. Gussy did not ascend immediately to the presidency of the company. That role initially passed to his older brother, and Gussy spent those years building influence, expanding his networks and demonstrating through action rather than title that he was exactly the kind of person an empire needed at its center. He served in World War II, worked with distinction at the Pentagon, earned military honors that reflected genuine commitment, and still managed throughout all of it to remain recognizably, irreducibly himself, the man who brought wit and swagger and the expectation of a good time into every environment he entered. When his brother passed away in 1945, Gussy finally assumed the leadership that everyone who knew him had always understood was coming. And when he became president, he did not simply run Anheuser-Busch. He performed it in the fullest and most generous sense of that word. Under his stewardship, the company did not grow quietly. It grew loudly, visibly, in ways that were inseparable from his own enormous personality. He was a flamboyant and deeply effective king of a commercial kingdom, and he knew it and he loved it, and he used that self-awareness to build something that extended far beyond the product itself. The mansion at Grant's Farm had remained relatively subdued during those years following August Sr.'s passing. The weight of what the big house had absorbed made it a difficult space to simply return to as though nothing had happened. But Gussy was not the kind of man who could allow a building to hold power over him forever. What he needed, and what he eventually found, was someone whose energy could match the scale of what the estate had once been. Someone who could walk into those quiet rooms and fill them with warmth, color, and the sound of life returning. That person appeared not in Missouri but in the hospitality of a Swiss city, in the soft light of a family restaurant in Lucerne that Gussy visited in 1949. Working as a hostess in that restaurant was a young woman of 22 named Gertrude, called Trudy by everyone who knew her, and she possessed a kind of radiant warmth that made the entire atmosphere of a room feel more welcoming simply by her presence in it. She was blonde and gracious and smiling with the specific ease of someone who genuinely enjoys people, and Gussy, in the manner of a man who had never in his life been uncertain about what he wanted, made his decision in the time it took him to cross the room and introduce himself. He stayed. He lingered over the evening for as long as he could reasonably justify. He ran up an impressive tab driven not by extravagance but by the simple unwillingness to let the night end before he had made some kind of impression. By the time the evening was drawing to a close, he had already asked her out. And before that first date had concluded, he had proposed to her. It was impulsive in the way that only a certain kind of confident, decisive personality can be impulsive, not reckless but absolutely certain. There was the practical matter of his existing marriage, from which he was estranged, and so Gussy did something slightly unusual for him. He was patient. He courted Trudy across an ocean with letters and gifts and the kind of sustained, considered attention that communicates seriousness more effectively than any grand gesture. He offered her not merely comfort and security but a role, the role of bringing a grand and historic estate back to full and magnificent life. In 1952, after his divorce was completed, Gussy and Trudy married. She was 25. He was 53. The difference in their ages was simply not something either of them appeared to consider particularly relevant to what they were building together. Trudy arrived at Grant's Farm with the instincts and the energy of someone who understood that a house becomes a home through the specific quality of attention given to it. She insisted that the big house be reopened fully and properly, that the rooms be cleaned and restored, that the interiors be refreshed, that the spirit of the place be actively renewed rather than simply preserved. The locked rooms were aired out and decorated. The hallways that had been still for years began to carry the sound of footsteps and voices and laughter again. Parties returned to the estate, along with flowers and music and guests who came not merely to be impressed but to genuinely celebrate. Trudy brought with her a deep appreciation for German cultural tradition, and under her influence, the gatherings at Grant's farm took on a warmth and a festive spirit that connected the Busch family back to their immigrant roots while simultaneously displaying their standing at the very top of American society. Staff received generous bonuses. Champagne flowed with sincere hospitality. Harvest festivals rang with folk songs and the kind of communal joy that makes a large estate feel genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied. Grant's farm under Trudy and Gussy became a place where the most powerful figures in American life came to pay their respects and thoroughly enjoy themselves in the process. Presidents visited. Dignitaries and celebrities moved through the rooms and across the grounds. The estate transformed from a private retreat into something closer in spirit to a royal court, a gathering place for the people and institutions that shaped American culture and commerce in the post-war decades. Gussy was not content to keep this world behind closed gates. He had the instincts of a showman and the strategic intelligence of a builder, and he understood something that his father and grandfather had perhaps not fully appreciated, that the most durable kind of power is the power that people have chosen to admire rather than simply accepted out of necessity. In 1953 he acquired the St. Louis Cardinals baseball franchise, stepping in to prevent the team's relocation and in doing so binding the Busch name to one of the most beloved institutions in the city's cultural life. It was a business decision, but it was also an identity decision. Owning the Cardinals meant owning a piece of St. Louis's collective soul. It gave Gussy a stage far larger than any boardroom and a platform from which to weave beer marketing into the fabric of American sporting culture in ways that no advertising campaign could have achieved alone. And then came the decision that would change the character of Grant's farm permanently and in doing so create one of the most beloved and freely visited attractions in the entire region. In 1954, Gussy opened portions of the estate to the general public at no charge. The idea grew from a simple and deeply human observation, that the world behind the gates of a great estate holds a fascination for ordinary people that no marketing can manufacture or replicate. People wanted to see it. They wanted to step inside the story, even if only for an afternoon. Gussy listened to that desire and responded with a generosity that was also, characteristically, excellent strategy. Within a remarkably short time, thousands of visitors were streaming through the grounds each season, riding trams through the landscape, feeding animals with delight, marveling at a piece of Missouri and American history that felt like something between a fairy tale and a living museum. The Bauernhof, a Bavarian-style courtyard complex with warm timber-framed architecture that made visitors feel as though they had stepped briefly into a European village, became the heart of the public experience. Stork statues stood as traditional symbols of good fortune. The Budweiser Clydesdales were housed in stables so beautifully constructed and maintained that visiting them felt like a genuinely ceremonial experience. The horses themselves had by this point become something far larger than a marketing asset. They were symbols, cultural icons, creatures whose presence had become inseparable from the identity of the brand and the emotional vocabulary Americans associated with strength, tradition, and honest American pride. Beyond the stables, the grounds opened into a landscape that seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Exotic animals roaming terrain that blurred the lines between Missouri farmland and something resembling a private global menagerie. Buffalo moved alongside zebras. Camels occupied spaces near kangaroos. A deer park provided quiet wonder for visitors of every age. The effect was overwhelming in the best possible way, a place where the extraordinary felt accessible and where wealth had been translated into a gift that the public could actually receive and enjoy. People fell in love with Grant's farm not because it was grand, though it was, but because it invited them in and made them feel welcome inside something genuinely magical. Under Gussy's direction, Anheuser-Busch grew in every direction simultaneously. Budweiser expanded its dominance across the American market with a consistency that made competitors seem almost irrelevant. The Cardinals won championships. St. Louis embraced the Busch family with an affection that went beyond civic pride and approached something closer to genuine love. For a sustained and luminous period, it appeared that the family had solved one of the oldest and most persistent problems in the entire history of American wealth: how to be powerful without inspiring resentment, how to be extraordinarily rich without becoming isolated from the people who ultimately make that richness meaningful. Gussy had opened the gates, invited the public to participate in the fantasy, and in doing so had created a relationship of warmth and goodwill that forgave a great deal and remembered even more. But the nature of large stories is that they contain more than their brightest passages. In 1974, a loss arrived that no degree of wealth or power or public affection could soften or negotiate. Gussy's youngest daughter Christina, born when he was already well into his elder years, adored as only a late-life child can be, passed away in a car accident at the age of 8. The loss reordered something fundamental in him. The man who had always seemed too large and too energetic and too thoroughly present to be broken was suddenly and visibly diminished by grief. He pulled inward. His behavior became less predictable. The people closest to him watched with concern as the weight of that loss changed the man they had known, and worried about what sustained grief and the habits it encouraged were doing to both the man and the institution he led. Trudy, after decades of remarkable partnership and the revival of everything the estate had once promised, reached the point where she could no longer sustain what their life together had become. In 1978 she asked for a divorce, and the marriage that had reopened the big house and filled it with music and celebration and the genuine warmth of a family in its fullest expression came to a close. The estate that had rung with its most glamorous and generous era under Trudy's influence grew quieter again, carrying once more the particular weight of a house that has known more than it can easily explain. And then came a moment of corporate transition that Gussy experienced as something very close to personal betrayal. The board of directors, responding to concerns about his leadership, moved to restructure the company's executive arrangements in ways that effectively removed Gussy from day-to-day control. The person positioned to step into the central role was his own son, Adolphus Busch III. For a man who had poured the entirety of himself into building and leading the empire for decades, being set aside by the very institution he had shaped felt like an exile. He retreated to Grant's Farm with the particular dignity of a man who refuses to disappear, wandering the grounds that had once been his most enthusiastic stage, surrounded now by the complex quiet of a life that had given him extraordinary highs and equally extraordinary losses. There were other chapters in the Grant's Farm story that belonged to the category of difficult human experiences that large and powerful families sometimes face, moments involving young members of the household and the kinds of accidents and legal proceedings that follow. In each instance, the outcomes were determined by the evidence and the legal processes available, and in each instance, the results were recorded and closed in the manner that institutions deal with such matters. These are the chapters that remind careful observers that privilege and tragedy are not mutually exclusive conditions, and that the same visibility that makes a powerful family's achievements feel inspiring can also make their most painful moments feel like evidence of something larger about the relationship between wealth and consequence in American society. Gussy lived 13 more years after the corporate transition that had removed him from center stage. He married again, this time to his longtime secretary, Margaret, who became the first woman ever to serve on the Anheuser-Busch board of directors, a distinction that deserved more attention than it typically received. Margaret passed away unexpectedly during those years, leaving Gussy alone in the final stretch of a life that had contained more drama, more achievement, more genuine generosity, and more personal loss than most people experience across several generations. In 1989, Gussy passed away at Grant's Farm at the age of 90. His will, when read, revealed the full complexity of the feelings and relationships he had carried through all those decades. He left symbolic objects and meaningful instructions about art and possessions. And to the son who had assumed his throne at the company, he left something notable in its simplicity: a single golden telegram passed through generations, a gesture that communicated everything without explaining anything. Even in the final arrangement of his affairs, Gussy could not resist sending a message. After Gussy, the big house at Grant's Farm gradually evolved from a personal residence into something closer to a ceremonial space, a monument used for gatherings and special occasions, the physical embodiment of a dynasty that had reached its peak and was moving into a different relationship with its own legacy. The family story continued, of course, because these stories always do. They simply change in character as the generations that carry them change in their own character. Gussy's grandson, August Anheuser-Busch IV, grew up inside the full expectation of dynastic continuation. He had the presence and the charisma that people instinctively associate with heirs to powerful names, and he also carried within him a quality of restlessness that made him simultaneously magnetic and unpredictable. There were chapters in his story that involved legal proceedings, questions of accountability, and outcomes that observers found difficult to reconcile with the standards that applied to people without the resources and legal representation that the Busch family could deploy. In each case, the official conclusions were what they were, recorded and closed as institutions close such things. And through all of it, the young man continued to rise within the company that his family had built, shaping marketing campaigns, developing his commercial instincts, becoming in practice the heir that everyone around him had always understood he was being prepared to be. In 2006, August IV became chief executive of Anheuser-Busch, taking the seat at the center of the empire that his great-great-grandfather had built from the modest beginning of a brewing supply business in a riverfront city more than a century earlier. He was the last member of the Busch family to hold that position. Because in 2008, something happened that no amount of family legacy or individual resistance could prevent. The Belgian-Brazilian company InBev made a formal offer to acquire Anheuser-Busch in a transaction valued in the billions. August IV fought the acquisition with every tool available to him, but the board of directors, including his own father, ultimately determined that accepting was in the company's best interest, and with that decision, more than a century of Busch family ownership came quietly and irrevocably to an end. The empire that had begun with an 18-year-old immigrant stepping off a boat in New Orleans with ambition as his primary asset had passed into the ownership of a multinational corporation headquartered far from Missouri. The family remained wealthy, remarkably, generationally, uncomplicatedly wealthy, but the crown was no longer theirs to wear. There were further personal chapters in the years that followed, involving relationships and losses of the kind that follow powerful and complicated people through their lives. Through all of it, Grant's farm remained standing. And that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. The mansion endures. It outlasts the individuals who built it, inhabited it, grieved inside it, celebrated inside it, and eventually departed from it. It absorbs decades with the patience of stone and brick. It has been a private palace and a public attraction. It has hosted presidents and tourists and dignitaries and children feeding baby goats on a sunny Saturday afternoon. It has been the site of the grandest hospitality the Midwest has ever seen and also the setting for moments of profound personal loss that had nothing to do with grandeur. Today, visitors continue to arrive at Grant's farm with the same eagerness that visitors have brought since Gussy first opened the gates in 1954. Children stretch their hands toward animals with laughter and delight. Tourists photograph the magnificent Clydesdale stables with the reverence those horses have always commanded. The Bauernhof courtyard continues to create the impression of an imported European village transplanted intact into the Missouri countryside. The Deer Park continues to inspire the particular kind of wonder that comes from encountering the unexpected in a beautiful and carefully tended landscape. And nearby, Hardscrabble still stands, the cabin that Ulysses S. Grant built with his own hands during the years when his future was anything but certain, when the soil refused to cooperate and the weather had its own ideas and the firewood he sold in St. Louis was the distance between his family and hardship. That structure is one of the most honest and quietly moving reminders available to anyone who stands on that land and thinks carefully about what they are standing in the middle of. A future president struggled here, found himself reduced to the most basic forms of survival here, lost this land in financial difficulty, and left behind a cabin that his greatest admirers have preserved precisely because it tells a truth about human experience that the monuments and the museums and the formal portraits cannot. A German immigrant family purchased a portion of this same ground and raised upon it a castle that competed with the grandest estates of Europe. They built a brand that entered the cultural bloodstream of an entire nation. They opened their gates and shared their world with ordinary people who came by the millions and left with memories they carried for the rest of their lives. And through all of that extraordinary achievement, they also experienced the full weight of the human experiences that wealth cannot exempt anyone from: grief, loss, the complex dynamics of family, the particular loneliness that sometimes comes with being exactly as powerful as you always wanted to be. In 2017, members of the family moved with renewed intention to secure Grant's farm's future, to maintain it as an operating attraction, to preserve its character and its history, to ensure that the public could continue to visit and experience a place that holds within its landscape one of the most layered and genuinely American stories ever unfolded on a single piece of ground. The big house itself remains private, not a permanent family residence but a beautifully maintained venue available for weddings and special events, a backdrop against which new stories are continuously being written by people who arrive with their own hopes and joy and intention, in rooms that have witnessed more history than most buildings ever accumulate. And that is where the whole extraordinary story arrives at something that feels almost poetic in its complexity. Couples now stand in those rooms and exchange their most important promises in spaces that were built as monuments to empire. Guests raise their glasses in hallways that have absorbed every possible kind of human emotion. Photographers capture moments of happiness and beginning against ceilings and walls that have listened to everything this dynasty carried across more than a century. The past and the present occupy the same beautiful, complicated space simultaneously, separated only by the human capacity for renewal, by the remarkable and enduring ability that people have always possessed to walk into a room full of history and fill it with something new. If you stand anywhere on that land and look up at the mansion rising above the Missouri hills, you feel the pressure of all the stories that have been pressed into it over the generations. Immigrant ambition arriving by ship from the old world and reshaping the new one. Presidential struggle and perseverance on the very ground beneath your feet. The survival of a brewing empire through the single era most designed to destroy it. Public generosity on a scale that welcomed millions of ordinary people into an extraordinary world. The complex intimacy of family life lived at a scale most people will only ever observe from the outside. Love found unexpectedly in a Lucerne restaurant. Grief that changed a man who had seemed too large to be changed. A dynasty that gave America its most recognized and beloved beer, its most iconic marketing image in the form of the Clydesdales, and also, in all the complexity of its human story, a reminder that the American dream, when it is extended across generations and stretched into the architecture of a dynasty, carries with it a weight that beauty and success and open gates and good beer can balance but never fully lift. The mansion still stands. The public sections of the grounds still open their arms to visitors who come seeking wonder and usually find it. The horses still move through the landscape with the dignity that has made them symbols of something beyond themselves. And somewhere in the private portions of the big house, in rooms that most people will never enter, the long memory of everything that happened here continues to exist. Not as a tidy and reassuring narrative, not as a fable with a clear moral, but as a long and layered and genuinely extraordinary echo of the truth that the most powerful story America has ever told about itself, the story of what it means to arrive with nothing and build something that lasts, always comes with a shadow. Precisely as long as the dream that cast it.